Welcome to the Mom as Well podcast, where we are digging deep into the gifts and the gaps of foster and adoptive parenting. I'm Tara Hutton, and I'm glad you're here. Mama's Well. Yes, she is. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time at the Mom as Well podcast, let me tell you what you're in for. I started this podcast thinking that this was going to be about foster care and adoption, and it is. It is about foster care and adoption, but it is about so much more than that. And I'm recognizing that when you bring children into your home who've experienced trauma, it triggers our own trauma, and it triggers our own attachment wounds and our own, the places in us that weren't maybe nurtured in the way that we needed them to be so when we were young. And it's an opportunity. So anytime we're involved with people that are hurting, it will hopefully force us to look inside and to find those places that are hurting in ourselves and to heal them. And so that's really what this is about. It's about reparenting. It is about parenting, but it's also about reparenting ourselves. So if you're into that kind of thing, then you're in the right place, and I'm glad you're here. Today, this is going to be, I've been looking forward to this podcast for a while with this guest, and she has been through one of the biggest tragedies any of us would ever, the loss of a child. That's unimaginable. And I think that, someone who has been through something like that, first of all, it takes a lot of bravery to sit here and talk about it. And so I'm super thankful for her bravery. And when you hear her speaking, you will be very blessed. But we're gonna talk about. She'll tell her story. But I think today, if I had to guess, I think we're going to be talking about something I keep bringing up, and that is codependency in our parenting. And I keep saying it's showing up for me, but I think that it's probably very prevalent when we're raising kids, especially kids who've struggled and who struggle. And so I'm not quit talking, and I'm going to introduce you to this beautiful woman, Janet Ropp, right?
Ropp. Janet Ropp.
All this time I've been saying Ropp.
It's okay.
I guess it would need an E on the end to say that.
Yeah, that's okay.
So it's R-O-P-P.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
R-O-P-P.
either way, you're still beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. Janet, you were, when I first met you through an acquaintance, you were very, very open and still very raw. And I'm sure, I don't know if that rawness ever goes away, but sharing about the death of your son. And I want to get there, but could you just tell us a little bit about your story and how, tell me about your life right now, but then I would love for you to talk about your childhood growing up and kind of share a little bit about that. So,
yeah.
First of all, what do you do right now? What are you doing in this world right now?
I am dabbling with many different things.
Many things. Okay.
I was in the medical field for 25 years.
Okay.
And I let go of the medical field about 2 years ago. And since then, I've just kind of been doing a lot of real estate work. Mm-hmm. I help my fiance with his job. Mm-hmm. I care for my mother, who's now moved here. I just kind of dabble with a lot of different things, and I love having my freedom. I love having the flexibility to be able to do whatever it is I want when I want, such as this podcast.
Yeah. So, right now you had two children. You have two children.
I do have two children.
Tell us about them.
My daughter, Janelle, she is 24. She has a child herself. I have a grandson of 4 years old. His name's Joaquin. And my son, James, who is no longer with us, he would be 22, I believe, this year. Just kind of, I'm having a pretty good relationship with my daughter, but it took some time. I think the death of my son catapulted us in directions that we could have never imagined.
Yeah.
We all were trying to cope And it really kind of put a lot of distance, I think, between me and my daughter. And over the past year, I would have to say we've started finally coming back together, kind of reconnecting, sharing stories about things, just trying to get to know each other again in a whole different way.
Yeah. You guys have had, from the story that you've told me and shared some of it with me, I mean, your life, from your early on childhood, you had a rough go.
I did. I was raised by a single mom who herself was struggling. She was struggling with, the loss of relationships. She was struggling with addiction. She was a heavy drinker. So I was already being raised in an environment where there was a disconnect. I did witness some violence. And I think back then in those years, parents really did kind of raise their kids that you were to be seen and not heard. And so most of my days was a matter of, leaving the home and being gone. And I just didn't really have a whole lot of structure. I don't recall having that mother-daughter bond. I feel like I was kind of on my own for the most part. And I was growing up with probably a lot of anger that was being instilled, whether it be learned or just creating it on my own. But I was carrying quite a bit of anger. And I was very defiant. As I had gotten older in my teenage years, I moved out at a young age, and I was very defiant, very hard around the edges, very rough around the edges. I kind of turned into my teenage years becoming more of a fighter.
Your trauma response.
Yes.
Fight.
I was fighting.
Fight, flight, freeze. You're a fighter.
Oh, yeah. Very much so. I've calmed down a lot, but it took maturity and a lot of work to calm down those areas. And I think, too, because I had moved out at such a young age, I had met a wonderful guy, but he, too, also had an addiction to alcohol. And our marriage was very turbulent. I didn't have the coping skills. I mean, I was a very shut down individual. I had no idea of who I was. I had no idea what I wanted. I was just angry. I was angry at the world. I was very much in a victim mode. I was blaming everybody for my problems. I would blame my mother. My mother was my biggest culprit. I blamed her for everything. When things weren't going right in our marriage, it became front and center that this has got to be my mom's fault. She did the damage. It was her fault always. And then it turned over to where it was becoming my ex-husband's fault. He was drinking a lot, and he was struggling with his own issues, his own set of complications in life with, alcohol and drugs. And I didn't realize it at the time, but that's when my codependency really flared. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was called. All I knew is that I was miserable. I was hurting. I was in a lot of pain. I didn't feel like people could hear me. I didn't feel like people could see me. I felt completely invisible in this world, in that marriage, in my relationships. And the more invisible I felt, the angrier I was becoming. The more of a force I was becoming. And I think it wasn't really until I was about 26, I had already had my daughter at that point, and then I had already had my son. So I had 2 infants that I was caring for, and our relationship was not good. Our marriage was very turbulent. We were arguing a lot. I was trying my best to get him sober. That was my goal. My focus and my entire goal at that point in time was to get him sober. Because I knew if I could get him sober, then I would not have repeated the pattern that I knew I had just repeated. I went from one home of alcoholism over into another one. And I kind of promised myself I would never put myself in that position again, and I did.
So let me stop you here, and will you explain, what is codependency? I think you just said it, but like, say it again. Say what is codependency?
Codependency for me was the addiction or the fixation. I'll use fixation.
Okay.
It was an extreme fixation on another person to try to change him or them, fix them, control them, turn them into what I needed them to be, extract an enormous amount of love or compliments from them. It was always, my focus was constantly on what I could do to them or what I could get from them. How I could manipulate them, how I could turn them, mold them, construct them into what I needed them to be. It had nothing at all to do with me. There was no focus put on myself at all. In my mind, I thought I was good. I thought,
why do people do that? I mean, why? Obviously, it's not just because you're like a controlling person. I mean, what's the root of you needing to do that or wanting to do that or feeling the desire?
Well, I think I had kind of mentioned it a little bit already, but I was empty. I was just a complete empty void of a person. I was just a shell. I had no understanding of feelings. I had no understanding of my beliefs. I really didn't know what I liked or what I didn't like. I have heard somebody else mention before, I was a chameleon that landed on plaid. I could turn and shift into anything that anyone needed me to be for them, just so I could get their love, just so I could get their acceptance, their attention, and it cost me dearly. But codependency is almost another set of addiction problems. Like I was drinking. I was drinking quite a bit in my young years. I was going with the flow of the party. I was drinking with my ex-husband. But, over time I pulled back and I kind of put the drinking to the side because I was kind of ready to grow up. And I noticed that other behaviors had surfaced when I quit drinking. Or not quit, but when I had kind of slowed down. I had noticed that other behaviors popped up quite a bit, and it was just my own insecurities. I was so...
Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think I was just so desperate for love. I was so desperate to feel loved. I was so desperate for attention, but I was also desperate without knowing it, for attention and for security. I needed security.
And you were trying to get this is what I think you're saying. It's like codependency is dependence. You're dependent on this other person
Correct.
To give you something that you need.
Correct.
To feel safe or to feel seen or to feel heard.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's how it showed up for me.
Yeah.
And when I say security, what I mean by security is that I needed to feel safe.
Sure.
In my life, in my world, in my home, in my marriage. And my ex-husband's behavior always was very unpredictable. And it left me feeling unsafe.
Sure.
It left me feeling nervous and insecure. I didn't know what was going to happen from day to day or what his drinking may look like from this point to that point. And I can recall there was a night where I had gone to bed early and he went to bed after I did. But when I woke up the next morning, the garage door was left open. And I can remember that kind of being one of the final factors in our marriage because I thought, he's drinking so much he doesn't remember to shut the garage door. I mean, that's a safety issue for me. And it just really shot through my body when I saw that garage door was left open. And for some people it may not be a big deal, but for me, it just completely added to the already, the loss of security that I was feeling in that marriage and that relationship. But yeah, everything that I needed in my life to feel good, I was trying
to get from him.
to extract from him. But him having his own addictions, he was not capable of giving me those things.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he did the best that he could with what he had, but what I needed truly was something that I needed to find for myself. And I was unaware of it at that point. I was still going to other people.
Yeah. So how does this show up? So you have these two children. Progress the story a little bit to where you're like, tell us how you have these two children, right? And then I think I might have interrupted you, but how does that progress? How does codependency? Because this is the thing that I keep going, I think I see this, but this shows up in our parenting too, like that wound of needing someone out here to make us feel okay. How does that show up for parenting?
Oh gosh, that shows up. That's an even more complicated codependency issue is parenting.
Yeah.
And I could probably talk about that for days.
Yeah.
But I think for me, my kids, I love my kids. I loved my kids back then. But I knew in my own way I didn't have the skills to raise them. And I was very scared. I was scared to death of raising these kids. They needed things from me that I myself was incapable of giving them. I didn't understand. I was still such a young mother, and I had already come out of a very, very turbulent divorce that lasted for several years. But I didn't know how to give these kids love, patience, consideration, acceptance. There was so many things that I just didn't know how to give these kids. And I really needed them at that point in my life. I just needed them to do what I asked them to do. And that was really all I was asking of them, is just simply do what I've asked you to do.
Because you not doing it is making me feel anxious.
That's right. Because when you're, running around or having your own spirit, your own mind, your own thoughts, I don't know how to respond to that. And I get very afraid. So I raised my kids really with a good dose of fear behind everything I did. But I was completely unaware of that. I had no idea how much fear was steering my parenting choices. And I became aware of it gradually over the course of many years. I had already started seeking out help for myself at the tail end of my marriage.
Okay.
And because the divorce itself was so turbulent, I didn't really continue that help. But once our lives settled down a little bit and I was in my own home and I had both of the kids with me, I started going back to recovery groups, and I started going to Al-Anon, which an ACOA, which is Adult Children of Alcoholics Support Group. And I went there because I knew that on some level I needed help. I needed help. It was just really that simple. I had no clue who I was still as a person, as an individual. I didn't really know who I was as James and Janelle's mother. I really wasn't completely confident of even how to live a single life by myself. I had never really lived in a home, paying my own bills, working at a job, raising two kids. This was the first time for a lot of different things that I was going through and experiencing. And I think the more fearful I got, the more I wanted to control. That was always kind of my go-to outlet, was I needed to control. I needed to control the environment in the home, and I needed to control the kids, and I needed to control what was going on around all of this. I was turning into a very huge control freak. But again, I was unconscious to any of this. It took me years to really clue in to what codependency really was doing in my life, how it was kind of living under the radar. It's kind of a veil of denial in some regards, because I wanted to keep thinking that I had all of my stuff together. when really I didn't have anything together. I mean, I was kind of crazy on some levels, and my kids might even admit that too. There would be times that, you know, I would cry or for no reason, which there's nothing wrong at all for crying, but at those stages and those times in my life, I did not know where these tears were coming from, and it was scaring me.
Yeah, I think that a lot of, I know I can relate to just being so out of touch with myself.
Oh yeah.
And just like, I remember just feeling, at times, just feeling like I don't know why I'm feeling this way, but I am completely out of control and I don't have any answers for it. You know, there's no answers.
Yes.
Yeah.
That-
And you just, all you know to do is look out at what's loudest and shut it down.
That's right. And at that point in time, my son was, I think, about 5-ish when I had already started to notice behavioral problems. And the schools were calling. I was getting notifications from the school for behavior disruptions. And it wasn't long before, you know, I was being kind of bullied, pushed, persuaded to seek out some mental help for him, and I did. And he ended up being diagnosed with ADHD, and they wanted to medicate, and I wasn't buying the whole ADHD diagnosis, and I really wasn't buying the whole medication, but I also knew that if I didn't really comply, I would have to take him out of school,
What
put him
did
somewhere
you
else.
think the problem was? Or what did, in your mind, what did you think was going on with him?
Well, without having a whole lot of education
Yeah.
into what was happening in my life, I had a funny feeling that it had something to do with my background. I felt it had something to do with my ex-husband's lifestyle. I knew it had something to do with the turbulent divorce we had gone through.
So you thought it was trauma.
I felt like, yes, a lot of those factors were playing a role, and my son was feeling the stress of this entire situation, and he was acting out
Yeah.
what he was feeling.
You're wise. You're wise for such a young mom.
I had that feeling.
Yeah.
I can't say that I knew how to put it into words back then, but I just knew that I wasn't completely sold on the
Yeah.
diagnosis they were giving me. I felt like there was something more. There was something deeper, bigger that was happening that a simple pill was just not going to fix.
Right.
And that's what was, I think, the system, the school system was wanting, is
Yeah.
a simple pill that could fix the
Yeah.
child and allow him to learn.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I did put my son on the medication reluctantly, and I tried to do it sparingly. You know, of course, weekends and
Yeah.
holidays, and so I tried not to give him the medication as much as
Yeah.
was necessary. But I could also see that this medication stole my son's spirit. You know, we went from a child who was literally bouncing off of the furniture and the walls, and just had an extreme amount of energy. You couldn't even carry on a conversation with him. He was just so overloaded with stimulus and information. And, he was just a very outgoing child. But I think whenever we put him on the medication, he turned into kind of a robot. It just stole his spirit. It stole the life out of him. And he was just simply functioning. Was he doing better in school? Yeah. I mean, he was, he started to comply better. But it took away his appetite. So he was losing weight. So there was another level of complications, even with the medication and that diagnosis, because then it was requiring therapy.
Yeah.
It was requiring, counseling, all this extra stuff, with the school system.
Yeah.
So I was overwhelmed. I mean, I was completely overwhelmed, and I couldn't really understand. I still was not really understanding the big gamut of what was going on in this whole parenting cycle. I mean, I knew I had a child who needed some type of help. I didn't know what kind of help to give him. The help I was providing wasn't working. I had another child, Janelle, who seemed to be doing fairly well. You know, she just kind of seemed to understand and get things and didn't really require as much hands-on. But she was also being affected a lot because she was watching that my son was now getting a lot of negative attention. He was getting a lot of negative feedback, not simply just from me, but I'm sure it was happening in the schools with the teachers, with the friends. You know, he was getting a lot of negative feedback, and I think it had already started in at that point in time to it was started affecting his self-esteem. And my daughter was seeing a lot of this, and she was being affected. And my ex-husband had remarried a few years after we divorced, and his new wife was not, I don't think she treated my son very well. And I think there was some complications from all of that. So I ended up seeking out more therapy for myself, for my son, for my daughter, because I could also tell that, you know, both kids were affected by this new marriage, this new relationship. They were having a lot of struggles. The kids were. And so that was kind of playing a role too. And I think back, and I just remember how these poor little kids, and even including myself as a kid, I think what we need as kids is so simple. It's just so basic.
What is it?
It's just love and attention. It's just kindness. It's just nurturing. You know, spending a few one-on-one moments with your child, you know, making that eye contact with them, you know, touching them, you know, caressing, you know, that gentle side of things. But yet for me, it seemed to be somewhat non-existent. I just didn't know those things. I didn't have those characteristics at that time in my life to know how to do that. And for some parents, I've seen where it comes so natural. And for me, it was something I had to literally work really hard at learning how to do. It just wasn't anything that came to me naturally.
Wow. And when do you feel like that started? Like, when did that work start? I mean, you mentioned that you've started seeking out therapy. I mean, you went through the divorce. Is that in the recovery groups and therapy? Where, I mean, what did you start to learn about yourself that kept you from being able to do that?
There were so many ups and downs. And I guess when I started going into therapy, I started going into Al-Anon groups on a pretty regular basis.
Okay.
And
Al-Anon is, what does that stand?
It's a support group for people who have been affected by somebody else's addiction.
Okay.
Whether that be alcohol, drugs, you know. But I knew I was affected by somebody else's addiction. And through the years, I started learning how it played out in my life. And one thing I had to start doing is I had to start acknowledging my childhood.
Yeah.
I had to start going back and really taking a look at where some of my dysfunctional thinking started. And now by going back into my childhood, this was not at all for me to place blame.
Sure.
I was not blaming my mother. I was simply going back, observing what was happening in my world at that time that would cause me to want to retreat, or what would cause me to be angry, or what would cause me to flee or disconnect. And having to go back and revisit some of those areas of my childhood was very hard, very scary. It brought up a lot of grief for me because I found myself grieving the loss of the childhood that I felt I should have had. And so there was a lot of grief that I was going through, I was moving through. And not only that, but I believe that, you know, my kids were triggering things in me that I was, again, unaware. I was unaware of what it was. I was unaware of where it was coming from, or how to cope with it, or how to deal with it. So each time something big would happen, with my kids or with me, or of course, I would call somebody from my group and I would just say, "This is what's happening. What do I do about it?" And they were so gracious. I mean, they would kind of sit with me on the phone. They would walk me through their own personal issues of what may have happened to them. They would help give me the verbiage of how to explain what I'm feeling. So I was having a lot of grief moving through my childhood, and that grief really spanned across many years. Because you're never done learning. You're never done exploring. So just when I felt like I had this issue, wrapped up and under control, this next big thing would be landing on my plate, and I'm scrambling around trying to figure out, what do I do with this? How do I cope? Where do I go? And so it was always like that. And in just trying to move through parenting, I was going through severe ups and downs, with still trying to, cope with, raising children on a day-to-day basis. But then I would have my own issues coming up that were very difficult. I learned how to journal at very early in my recovery years. So journaling was always a coping skill and a coping tool that I used religiously. When something would come up, I would have to just retreat to my room and I would have to journal, write about it, possibly call somebody, and kind of work through it that way.
Yeah.
So
you shared with me on the phone that one of the that you shared that with me, that when your kids, you would make sure you put your kids on a really tight, because you were a single parent at this point, right?
Oh, yes.
And you're, when I get triggered, sometimes, a lot of times, I can pass the buck to Kyle. Like, he can see I'm triggered and take over. Now, sometimes we trigger each other.
Yeah.
And then that's not good either. Then you have two triggered parents, and kids are already triggered. So that's a mess. But doing it alone is really tough, and you were doing some deep work. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, I wish you could come into parenting having already done this, right? But it doesn't work that way. Parenting is, the kids are actually the thing a lot of times that brings it up for us. Like, it's down way, way, way deep, and then they do things that our body remembers. They do things that trigger things that are stored in our unconscious.
Yes.
And then, whew, so it's like we're doing it together in a way. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's really what was happening with me on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah.
I was just being triggered all over the place. But as time went on, and as I was in recovery longer, I started to be able to recognize it a little bit better. So I kind of was calming down a little more.
Yeah.
Because I think in the early years, when I first started raising my kids, I was just on high anxiety all the time.
Yeah. Probably like little James.
Yes.
Yeah. Or both probably could have gotten some kind of diagnosis, right?
Yes, most definitely.
Let me stop you for just a second, because I think the Al-Anon groups, and there's, Al-Anon is kind of considered a codependency group, right?
Yes,
yeah,
very much so.
So you don't have to have an addict in your life to struggle with codependency, or do you?
No, you don't. But from what I've seen, because I've now been in recovery for probably 23 years.
Most people in those groups do.
Yes.
Yes.
Where you find a codependent, you will generally find a partner who is struggling with addiction, and vice versa.
Yeah.
They somehow seek each other out, because that person struggling with addiction needs that enabler. They need that enabler. And that codependency, they need someone to take care of or fix or control.
I guess that's me wondering, because I did have the addict, my biological father was an addict, but I didn't. By the time I was 2, I wasn't living with him regularly, but I still see so much, especially in my younger years, like so much of those codependent tendencies. I mean, I read The Language of Letting Go every single morning.
Oh, yeah.
Which is
Great
Melanie Beattie. She wrote Codependent No More and Codependent Guide to the 12 Steps. I mean, she's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
But I find, even though I wasn't like in direct contact, like I feel like many people, and maybe it's because we see addiction as like, okay, this person drinks a lot, or this person does drugs, or this person does alcohol, but addiction is not just those things, right?
No. Well, it's a, I mean, if you really go down to the root of things, I mean, we as human beings have found so many ways to escape being a human being.
There you go.
We have found all kinds of things so that we don't have to feel what we were designed to feel. We were designed to have feelings and emotions in this lifetime. Mm-hmm. I think that's how we were born, men and women both. Mm-hmm. And yet, as we grow up, we're faced with so much complication, so much turmoil, so much detachment, so much trauma, so much stress that we learn how to escape. We find little escapes through our world, whether it be food, whether it be sex, whether it be porn, boyfriends or dating or girlfriends, or there's so many escapes. And addiction is one of those things where we've just kind of learned how to escape what we're feeling, because we can go get a quick drink that is going to take all that away. We can, eat a whole bunch of food that is going to take all that away. And it's not that much different for a codependent personality either. I have found ways to escape what I'm feeling, namely through food. I have used food for quite a long time, but also through people. I can become fixated on people. And in my mind, I feel like I'm trying to help them, but already I'm sending the message that they can't help themselves. If I feel like I am in a role where I have to help somebody or fix somebody, well, I've already sent the message to that person that they're not capable.
Okay. This is good. This is something I become aware of on a daily basis. Let's go to that, because when you and I were talking on the phone, you said something that I wrote down, and you said, I made my son my project. So I can see that. You start to get a little better, right? You're going to recovery groups. And then, I mean, this happens to anyone who starts going to recovery groups or starts doing this work. They start recognizing it. They see it, and then all of a sudden they got to recognize it in everybody else.
Yeah.
Right? Ooh, I see that in you. Ooh, I see that in you. I see that in you. And it's so easy to shift the game. You were focused on here, and then now all of a sudden it's like, I see it everywhere, and I want to help you. And I think in parenting, it's like we're like a magnet for that, because we are the ones responsible.
Yes.
Well, so what happened with James?
And there was, like I said, I had mentioned earlier, I had this underlying fear about being a parent. And I didn't always know what that fear was. I never really knew until it surfaced or came up. But I think during the divorce, there was so much fighting and arguing and going back and forth. And there was also the constant, threat that, you're not a good enough mother. I can take the kids from you if I want to, there, and I know it was just a lot of anger and hurt going on back then, but that was a fear of mine. That really did become a fear that maybe I don't have what it takes to be a parent. Maybe I'm causing more harm to my kids than what I'm really doing. And so I think when James was acting out, he became my focus. He became, I zeroed in on him, And now I had decided on some level, probably unconsciously, that it was my job to fix him. As a parent, I needed to fix this child. And I needed him to be fixed
so that you could be okay.
could be okay.
Yeah.
And so that I could feel like I was doing an okay job as a parent. And not only
That's
that.
it.
Yes.
That's it. That's the codependency that catches me.
Yes.
It's like, I love my kids, so I want them to be okay, but it's more than that.
Well, and there's also the other aspect that I was afraid of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And I was already receiving a lot of judgment and criticism.
I'm sure.
But I thought, well, I can turn this around.
Mm-hmm.
I can make people see that I do have what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
If I can just get my son fixed, if
Mm-hmm.
I can just, alter and corral this behavior issue, and get him on the right path,
Mm-hmm.
people will see that I'm a good parent, and therefore I will be worthy.
Mm-hmm.
I will be worthy.
Yeah.
I will find my self-worth
Mm-hmm.
at that point in time. But in order for me to find my self-worth and feel good and be okay, I needed him to behave correctly, or behave within society's norm.
Yeah.
And that was just it became a journey.
Yeah. So fast forward a little bit. I mean, I'm kind of getting the picture. Like it's most of us are probably getting the picture because we've experienced it, right? But so where did you first start to notice? James, I can imagine if he was feeling all of this inside. The first thing, like you said, we want to medicate it. I mean, I think this is probably at the root of a lot of maybe all addiction. I had an addiction counselor on here, Adam Bertosh. I love him. I'll have to send you his. Did you listen to his podcast?
I don't think I
I'll have to
saw
send
that
it to
one.
you. Great
Okay.
guy. But we talked about, really the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yes.
And the cool thing when you think about that is like the reason we don't connect is lots of reasons we don't connect, but shame. But also, I mean, if you are feeling like the problem all the time, right, you just want it to stop.
Yeah.
And the fastest way to stop something, as Adam says, is, drugs are very predictable. You know what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
So where did you start to notice this? How old was he when you started noticing he was self-medicating himself?
Well, I'm going to back up just a little bit. The medication, the therapy that we had been going to for years, was still going through all my recovery groups at this point. And I guess I would have to say that I was noticing around 12, 13.
Okay.
And because the behavior was still there, even though we were medicating, when he was not on his medication, the behavior issues were still there. And it started escalating into more of, my son now was becoming angry. He was becoming more argumentative, more disrespectful. And so our relationship was really becoming a lot more troubling.
Yeah.
I wasn't happy with where we were at in our relationship. And then I had noticed that my son and my daughter were becoming kind of distant, very distant.
From you?
From me.
Okay.
More distant than normal. And I had started noticing that they were sneaking out at night. And then I later learned that, they were already dabbling with marijuana at that point in time. And I had a friend who had entered into a recovery group for families. It's a citywide group around Houston that is called Cornerstone Recovery. And it is for families who are struggling with kids that have issues. And those issues can range from alcohol addiction, drug addiction, to depression, to gaming. Gaming's a big one. And so at that young age, I got my kids into this program. I got myself into this program. And it's kind of a peer group support system, you know, where the kids kind of have their kids around their ages that they kind of cling to and are put with. And then the parents have their parent group. But it's a heavily involved program. The parents have to be completely involved in the program. And so I don't know really. I guess my intuition at that age when my kids were around 12 or 13 was that seeing that we had already a lot of addiction in our families, I felt like that's kind of where my kids were heading.
Yeah.
Especially when I learned that they were dabbling, you know, and experimenting with marijuana at those ages.
Yeah.
It just scared me. It scared me a lot, and I felt like I needed to find more help. And we were actually in that program for about 6 years, and my daughter, she was very consistent in that program. She did really well. She might have not been happy to be in that program. I don't think she was in the beginning, but it was a chance I took.
Yeah.
I felt like that was going to be a good thing for her.
Yeah.
They were already experiencing drugs in high schools,
Yeah.
in grade schools. They were already being faced with these huge issues in schools, in public school. So I pulled my kids out of public school and I put them into a private school that was directly connected to recovery groups. It's a sober high school. It's called Archway Academy.
Okay.
And it's a completely sober school, and they're connected with a lot of the counselors that run a lot of the APG programs around the city. And so, yeah, my kids went to a sober high school. And, but my son, you know, he was kind of in and out. He would do real well in the program. He would do real well in school. He would do real well at home. But it was almost like a light switch sometimes with him. He would, you know, just decide that he didn't want to do any of this anymore, and he wanted to go hang with his friends, and out the door he would go, and he would be gone for a couple of months. And I guess he would tire himself out, realize that things weren't that great out there, and eventually come home, and we'd start this process all over again. And two, there's a lot of things that I learned as a parent in Cornerstone about raising a child who is struggling with these types of difficulties. And you know, a lot of things that they teach is consistency, setting boundaries. You got to have boundaries in the home. And one of my boundaries is that you cannot live here and use chemicals this way. I just couldn't, I was too afraid to even open that door. So, I mean, I made that very clear in the home that I don't want people in the home who are abusing chemicals because it disrupts the energy flow we had in the home. So yeah, there was a lot of him moving in, moving back out, taking him to rehabs, coming back to the house, him, you know, getting his life all set back up again, you know, trying to rebuild our relationship, trying to rebuild trust. And then again, you know, he would be back out, you know, with his friends again, using. And that just kind of became the cycle with James throughout high school. You know, whereas my daughter was a little more consistent with her behavior and her path, James was kind of up and down. So it was very much a struggle for me again as a parent because, you know, now I'm really uncertain about what's happening.
Yeah.
I have no frame of reference. I don't know really where he's at, who he's with. I don't know when he's coming home. And I pushed really hard to try to instill certain principles in my kids at a younger age because I knew once they hit 18, I wasn't going to have the same type of handle on things. I wasn't going to have the same type of control. So all I knew to do at that point in time was just to build a foundation for my kids that, you know, if they got out into the real world and they encountered any kind of trouble, They knew where to go for help. They knew phone numbers. They had counselors' phone numbers. They had teachers' phone numbers. They had,
Yeah.
their friends.
Yeah.
So I built that foundation for them. So, and that's all I knew to do.
Well, that's all you can do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it didn't make things any easier always. I was still very much dealing with codependency issues. And I think as my son's behavior became a little more inconsistent, a little more erratic in his teenage years, my codependency was still, flaring up and down
Sure.
the same way. Because he was, again, triggering a lot of my childhood stuff.
Yeah.
And even my daughter had triggered a lot of my childhood stuff too at that time, but a lot of it seemed to be coming more so from my son. And, when we were good, as far as relationship, we were really good. And I miss those times when we could just sit and talk for hours.
Yeah.
And, my son was just so intuitive, very intuitive, very creative. He had a wonderful imagination. And I do miss those times.
Yeah.
It was very difficult.
And you're going on 4 years.
This October the 13th will be 4 years
Yeah.
since my son passed away, yes.
Would you like to share what happened, or?
My son was already out of the house at that time. He passed away when he was 19, so he had already, I guess, officially moved out of the house at that time. And I think as the time had gone on, my daughter and I were kind of seeing him less. We were communicating with him less. And I knew my instincts, my motherly instincts were kind of kicking in, and I knew something was not right. Because he used to be pretty good at responding to text messages or phone calls, and I think during that time it had slowed down. I wasn't really sure when I was going to hear from him again. And I just remember that day I was getting a facial, and my phone was going crazy in my purse. And when I was finished with the facial, I had gone out to the car and called the number, and it was the police, the detectives, asking me to come home. And again, I did. I went home, but the whole time I was thinking, gosh, I wonder what James did.
Yeah.
I'm sure he got himself into trouble
Yeah.
somewhere, somehow. And I think when I got to the house, that's when they told me that my son was deceased. And I think I just lost my entire breath at that point.
Sure.
But they were looking at it as a crime scene type of death because of where he was found. He was found outside behind a building. And so there was just a lot of questions, a huge investigation around it all. I guess
Did you know
that's...
at that time, again, your mother intuition know what had happened to him?
What do you mean?
I don't know. When you say crime scene, I'm thinking they thought someone killed him, but did you know that it had been an overdose, or?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they told me he died of an overdose.
Oh, okay.
I knew that much.
Okay.
But their concern was where he was found.
Okay.
They weren't sure if he died in someone's care and
someone
was
had just
placed
dumped
there.
him there. Oh.
Yes.
Wow.
That's what the crime scene was about. They
Yeah.
were trying to understand who was with them.
That's hard.
If somebody else was responsible,
Yeah.
possibly.
Yeah.
So yeah, we went on through that whole investigation, and I guess that you could say that that's probably where my real grief journey began.
Sure.
But little did I know that all those years I had spent in counseling and recovery, working on grief from my childhood, would help kind of bridge me during this type
Yeah.
of a grief.
Sure.
So, yeah, I mean, I just faced my grief every day.
Yeah, and still do.
And I still do.
Yeah.
I still do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow, Janet, that's like you know, that is just letting go of our children in spite of, you know, where you saw him going. You saw this coming in a way, you know, is so challenging. And yet that's it. That's all there is.
And there's such, you know, and going back to codependency again, it is so hard as a parent to stand back and watch your kids make poor decisions or self-destruct or be with the wrong person or it's just so hard to not want to jump in there and save them from all of that. I mean, I never wanted my kids to hurt or have problems or go through any of the stuff that I had gone through as a youngster. I didn't. Most parents don't want that for their kids. They want better.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's the piece of the pie that really kicks our codependency into high gear, because we feel, or I felt like, I was doing what was right for them, what was good for them, and on some level I was.
Sure.
I mean, but I think the fear was always there. The fear that I wasn't a good enough parent, that somehow I was going to be judged, or maybe my kids would be taken away because I wasn't doing it quite right, or maybe my kids would hate me.
Yeah.
Maybe they just didn't like me and didn't want to be around me. Maybe there was just so much fear underlying that fear, I think, was a lot of reason that I was engaging in codependency.
Yeah.
Not consciously,
Yeah.
but I just think those were things that would trigger my codependency to surface. And I just felt like I needed to fix everything. It was my job to fix these kids, to fix myself, you know, to fix my life, our lives, whatever it was. And part of that fixing came controlling and, just the gamut of codependency.
Yeah.
So
What would you say in closing? This is a heavy story. I have a feeling people are going to need to go lay down and take a nap or something.
it is
But
a lot.
in closing, like, what would you say to your younger self and to a mom potentially who is struggling in this same space as you are right now, or as you were back then? And I mean, this is just an ongoing journey, right? I mean,
Yes.
grief doesn't just go away. And you're coming up on a birthday. So it'll be triggered again. I mean, all these things trigger talking about it. You're probably going to have to go home and do some processing.
Oh, yeah.
But what would you say to the younger you, or the mom that's out there, mom or dad that's listening, who sees the writing on the wall, who's seeing this happen before their very eyes? What would you say? Just wrap us up with what would you speak directly to them if you want. What would you say to them? You can look in right that camera if you want to.
What I would say to my younger self is I would just validate her. I would validate what she's feeling, what she is going through, how much she is loved, and how much she is looked up to. These kids showed tremendous amounts of love at times when I couldn't, when I was not capable. And that was their spirit. That was my gift. My kids were my gift. They pushed me to go above and beyond all kinds of areas that I never thought I could do. But what I would say is that my younger self was so strong, so courageous. I mean, and that just needs to be validated. I just want her to feel so validated and accepted that young Janet was a force to be reckoned with. And she had tremendous bravery, tremendous courage. She broke through barriers that a lot of people have not done or can't do, or whatever the reasons are, I don't know. But I just would want to acknowledge her, and I do acknowledge her. That is something that is part of my recovery, and that is part of my healing journey, is to go back and get a hold of my young self and love on her and tell her that everything is okay and that she is accepted, she is loved. It could basically reparent her and tell her all those things that I didn't receive as a child. Now, to other parents that are struggling with this very situation, I would strongly suggest that they seek help wherever they can. Help is what really carried me through a lot of tough years. Just knowing that I had support from other parents that were in the same boat that I was in was huge. It helped me feel not alone. It took a lot of the anxiety out of the situation, and I would just suggest getting help.
Yeah.
Find help, whether it be counseling, therapy, support groups, books.
And support groups are free.
Support groups are
Books
free.
are basically free.
Yes.
Talking with other, finding community of people who are in the same boat is free.
Yes.
But there's other, and we talked about this briefly in one of our conversations, but man, sometimes we exchange, money, we buy what we want to buy. The truth is, we buy what we want to buy. And I think when we understand the value that the therapeutic process can be for us, it's well worth it. It's well worth it.
And it doesn't take a large amount of money to invest in yourself.
That's right.
Investing in yourself is probably the best gift you could ever give your kids.
Right. That's a perfect way to end it. Investing in yourself is the perfect gift you can give to your best gift you can ever give to your kids. Is that what you said?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Thank you, Janet.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I know you're going to be exhausted after this. I'm exhausted after this.
It's a lot.
Yeah, but it's a
lot.
beautiful story, and I know that James is feeling honored right now.
Yes.
And then I know that he is so enlightened at this point and sees all of these things, and that's the way I believe anyway. My mom and my dad, who are no longer physically on this planet, are very enlightened, and they understand, and it's a beautiful thing. And so anyway, thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So if you're struggling, if your child is struggling, please don't go at it alone. There is help. And reach out. We will put some links in the show notes. Is that good?
Yeah.
You've got some stuff to share?
Yes.
And make sure that you're not going at this alone, because it is not something. And recovery groups are free, and they're everywhere, and they meet every day. So at the very least, step into that. So anyway, don't forget, like and subscribe. Remember to leave a review. The reviews, I am going to just keep asking for these, but those are the reviews and the comments. When I ask a guest to come, they look at those. And so that helps me to get more guests. And I'm working for Dr. Brad Reedy. I want him to come. So I know it. When we get a certain number of reviews, Dr. Brad Reedy's going to come. Do you know Dr. Brad Reedy?
I don't.
I love him. I'll have to share him with you.
Okay.
So anyway, I hope you guys have a great week, and we'll see you next time.
Mama's well.
Yes, she is.